Welcome to Old Path and our study through the Old Testament. We make it to the book of I Chronicles today. Now, if you've been along with us for the whole study through the Samuel and then through the Kings, and now we're getting to Chronicles, you'll know that we ended last week at 2 Kings, the culmination of the book. And what you can see from that, it pretty much ends with the line of the kings as they go into that Babylonian captivity. So when you read that, you know obviously it had to have been written closely after that exile. But we also studied at the end of that study that it was going to last 70 years for the beginning of it till they could come back. And that would be with Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel would be the first to come back. Then it would be Nehemiah, and then it would be Ezra. And so what we have in front of us now in the book of I Chronicles is something that is written after those years of the time in Babylon. So there is debate, a lot of it, about who really authored this, but I don't think it takes a whole lot for us to understand that it was written quite a bit after they began to come back from Babylon. Many scholars would say that it was more than likely it was Ezra who had written this, and so we see the history of Ezra and Nehemiah, and really in the books that are here, Ezra and Nehemiah are part of the books of the Kings and of Chronicles. It's all seen as basically one collaborative book, and so the way that it's laid out is pretty interesting when you stop to consider it, because as we're going to see, and there's no reason to go into it a whole lot, we'll just see it as we go through it. But what you'll end up seeing, even the perspective of how it's written and the emphasis of it, it really is almost primarily focused on just the southern kingdom. It really doesn't deal much with what was going on up in the north. Like Kings really does a lot more of that. So that divided the divided country. And some have pointed out that it really seems to be much more that God wants to focus on Chronicles of the successes and when things were done as they should be rightly before God, though there's plenty of the failure that you'll see in here, and it'll become pretty clear. But from the perspective, and there's probably a reason why this is, and here's just my hypothesis. The people that are there reading the Chronicles don't need to be reminded of why things are the way that they are. They know why their Babylonian captivity came to pass, and they know of the failure that really caused it in the first place. So to be reminded of it is really already there. They have been displaced from the land from the beginning of it. It was over 100 years plus, and quite a bit past that, until Zerubbabel had begun the whole process, and then having it kind of come to full circle with Nehemiah and Ezra. So here they are back in the land, and the fact that they had been displaced, and I'm sure it's nothing even what its former glory was, so it probably didn't take a great deal for them to realize, yeah, we know what's happened and we know why. But with Ezra in particular, the desire was to get back to the way that things should have been, and the proper worship of God, the proper workings, if you will, around the temple, and getting things where they should be in the religious order, if you will, for the people of Israel around the temple. So that's kind of the backdrop for where we are at the time. I am reminded when we go through these books and this particular era of history, the reforms that happened, especially under Ezra, and the importance that Nehemiah had with not only rebuilding the walls, but putting things back to the way that they should have been. Anybody coming out of that captivity says we don't want to go back to what caused us to be displaced in the first place. And that would be an incredible motivation for the people who would be there back in the land, and then to be reminded, let's not repeat the same error. Well, that sounds great, but again, if you start to look through the chronology of things, it's really only about a generation and a half until from the time of Ezra and Nehemiah and all of the reforms and getting things back to the way that they were, till you read the things that happened in the book of Malachi. And so that by that time the priesthood is already corrupted yet again, And God is pretty much done with it and tells them so. And so we know that really that's kind of the time when there was the end of the writings of the prophets from Malachi, and really until God started to announce through John the Baptist that something new was taking place. So that's kind of the era in history that we look at here. The first 9 chapters of this book are dedicated to genealogy. And so it's not just this person begat that person. There's other little bits and details, and we'll look through some of it. This will probably be a little bit of a shorter study. I'm still trying to get my voice back, so that might work out just well anyhow. But what we have is really for the chronicler, whoever's writing this, whether it's Ezra or someone of contemporary times, it sure seems pretty much without question that this is written quite a while after they had even begun to come back into the land, after the 70 years that were pronounced. Jeremiah chapter 29, and then God bringing them back into the land. So that was the promise. The reason why is at the end of 2 Chronicles, because they didn't give the land rest. But that was the length of time. Why was it 70 years? Because they didn't give the land rest for 70 cycles of that 7th year of giving the land rest. So that was the length of time. The provocations that caused it in the first place are countless. And it was because of idolatry and wickedness and the things especially God points out directly in Manasseh. And so, oddly enough, it's from Chronicles that we end up finding 2 Chronicles that Manasseh repented in the end. We don't get that from Kings. And that's a really good thing for us to remember, that God wants to remember when a nation does what it's supposed to. That should be the emphasis, so as not to repeat the failure, but rather to repeat the things that were done well. So the first 9 chapters, like I say, genealogy, it kind of jumps right into the history with Saul. It's brief in chapter 10, and then it really kind of at that point, it focuses much more on David and then into Solomon. And so you'll see as it kind of unfolds. We'll get through the first 9 chapters today. We're not going to read every name because, frankly, some of them are interesting, and we'll point those out as we go. But most of them are not known to us. This is not an exhaustive genealogy. There are some gaps in it that people point out, and it's really more to make sure that the people understand their history all the way back to the beginning of creation, because it begins with Adam. And this is important to the Jewish people because they need to recognize their descendancy and how it not only works in the religious sense, because God began an order, if you will, through Moses and Aaron, where corporate worship would be done in a particular, very much prescribed way. God would raise up the people and give them the understanding of how it should operate. And that was given to the Jewish people alone. The promise began with Abraham to make a people out of him, and that really ultimately will culminate with the Messiah coming. And so for Jewish people in Ezra's time, after the restoration, we're talking at this point, 500 years BC, roughly. Let's just big round figures. So roughly 500 BC is what we're talking about here. And so 500 years before Messiah is to come in, now they're back in the land after their displacement. It is, let's put things back the way that they should be. We know it was short-lived, but nonetheless, to the Jewish people, to remember that God gave them a land. And it's without, when God promised it, it is completely without a shelf life. It is a forever promise. So it's not just the land, but it's also the people. And so they've been displaced through history, back and forth, but they also want to recognize that if they can look back through their genealogy, they know that they have been given this from generation to generation. And now here they find themselves at the end of their captivity back in the land, around Jerusalem in particular, and now it's time to put things back as they should have been, that had Israel walked with God like they were supposed to, according to his law, all the way up to Messiah, they would have never been displaced. They would have never been defeated. They would have never seen ruin. The nation wouldn't have divided had they been careful to keep all of the law and to keep all of God's commandments. Had they done that from the moment that God gave that to them through Moses, they would have been able to be an enduring world power, unchallenged, all the way up until Messiah, because then things were going to change. In the person of Jesus, the law was going to not have the same governing effect over people, because now salvation had been made possible. A perfect sacrifice had been found in the person of Jesus Christ, and now all mankind could be reconciled to God through his sacrifice. So where it would have gone from there is an interesting question, interesting debate, but just for the Old Testament sense of it, we take a look at this, 1 Chronicles. Let's turn to the first chapter, and we'll just highlight some of the kind of interesting, intriguing names and where they all fit and why it's important. So chapter 1, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you as we come to your word. We pray that you would give us ears to hear and understanding hearts and minds as we kind of work through the text here and glean from what we see. The beginning of the chapters, Lord, as we see them, we recognize a lot of names and a lot that we don't. And we pray, Father, that this would not seem in any ways to us tedious or even a repetition of history. We know that this is told from a different perspective. So help us to be encouraged by what we read and help us to be instructed and make proper application as we see it. We give you all thanks and praise in Jesus' name. All right. So 1 Chronicles chapter 1 starts this way. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So from Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the three sons that are mentioned there. So this shows you how far back it goes. So there's a very interesting study. We won't do it, but it's what these people's names actually mean. You can hit me up in the comments in YouTube if you want, or you can hit me up through the email. I'll send it to you. But there are people who have kind of worked a little bit through the names of each of those successive generations, and that there's a kind of a message to it, which is intriguing. But because it's like one of those things that I wouldn't say it's absolutely, there's no question about it. I'm not going to take the time with it. So anyway, from there, you see the descendants, the son of Japheth. And the reason I'm reading all of these is their names should sound familiar to you. They are where you would also get from Genesis 10 what's known as the Table of Nations. Now, this is where it helps us to understand a couple of important things. Where did they go after the flood? And what was the areas where they inhabited? Because where we find in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38 and 39, it's an intriguing prophecy passage that a lot of people look at and say it's a battle that's being discussed that is really still even future to our time, because it doesn't have a historical precedent. But it talks about the people of and their areas. So when we think about people that are in this part of the world or that part of the world, we think of the names of the countries, and we think of the borders that are pretty clearly delineated. That's this country, that's this country. It's kind of how we do our maps nowadays. Well, the areas that are mentioned in Ezekiel or the Table of Nations from Genesis 10 are really just geographical areas that don't have necessarily borders, as we would think, and they're really known by the names of the people who had gone there. So the three sons of Noah, as they began to have children and they went to various areas to populate those areas, those areas became known by the prominent people who were there. So when you read a passage like Ezekiel 38 and 39, just remember what's being spoken of there is Ezekiel using the oldest of the ways to recognize the name of a particular area. We would know them as the nation states today, but they were the geological areas back in that day. So what we do is kind of just try to overlay those things and say, when those nations that Ezekiel identifies based on Genesis 10, where are they in the world? And what will they have in common when they come against Israel? Because that ultimately is what happens. So here you're going to notice, if you're kind of the prophecy buff type person, and you're familiar with Ezekiel 38 and 39, these names are going to sound very familiar to you. So the sons of Japheth, they were Gomer, Magog, Medai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, Tiras. So some of those names sound familiar: Meshech, Tubal, Magog, and then Gomer. So that gives you an idea of the general area that we're talking about where they would have been, or Japheth's sons would have been. And we're talking about kind of Eastern Europe working its way towards, Turkey, and then into, some people would say, as far as Germania, and then up towards Russia. So in that northern part up there. So then it says the sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz, Japheth, and then Togarmah. And the sons of Javan were Elisha, Tarshisha, Kittim, and Rodanim. Verse 8, the sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Now we're starting to talk about the places down much more in like the northern portions of Africa. So much further south from what we were just talking about, that's much more in the north of Europe and then into the areas around Russia. So that's just big general geographic stuff that we're talking about. We don't have to be precise with borders. They didn't have them like we're thinking. So we're just talking about large geographical areas. Now, the sons of Cush were Sheba, Havilah, Sabta, Rima, and Sabcha. The sons of Rima were Sheba and Dedan. Okay, so modern day kind of the Saudi Arabia area. So this again gives you kind of the idea of what we're talking about. Cush beget Nimrod in verse 10, and he began to be a mighty one upon the earth. So that brings us all the way to the Tower of Babel. So from Adam to Babel, covered in the first 10 verses of this. Now, this again doesn't even get us to Abraham. What this is doing is giving the genealogy of man, but it also, we need to remember that God had always planned what was going to be done through the nation of Israel. And so these very prominent names and places, this is all after the flood. Let's make sure we understand that. Now, just as I say that, I was thinking about it before we started to record. There are people who may very well hear this and go, oh, wait, so you actually believe in the flood of Noah? Yeah, absolutely I do. Well, why? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, because Scripture says that it took place and God was there and he's the one who can give us the account of it, just like he did with creation. But I've been to the Grand Staircase. I've been to the Grand Canyon. I've looked at the strata layers. I've looked at how fossils are laid down. I've had it presented to me in a way that's not the corrupt nonsense that we hear through textbooks, who can't even really prove any of the things that they say. It's all theory. But I can show you parts of the earth where it's been scraped out by water in volumes no one has ever seen before. And it's right there for you to see. Not only is the strata that was laid down by the flood there, it's also been carved away as the water left the continent right here in the United States, in basically the northern part of Arizona and into the southern part of Utah. And it goes on for hundreds of miles. So there are no rivers on the planet that are that large, that carry that volume of water. Clearly, everything was underwater at one time. So I would refer you to a very good friend of mine. His name is Russ Miller, and Creation Ministries. If you just look up Russ Miller and Creation Ministries, go to his website, you'll find all kinds of really, really amazing videos and information that makes it obvious. This world was flooded, just as God said. And so we are seeing the descendants from Noah after those things that are being discussed here. So to me, it's not even a controversial thing. Now, by the time that we get to verse 28 of the first chapter here, notice what it says. The sons of Abraham were Isaac and Ishmael. So it takes just the first chapter till now we begin to open up what is the covenant people. And that's important from the perspective of the writer of Chronicles here, because it isn't the history of mankind that he's concerned with. It's the history of the children of Israel, in particular, the southern tribes. The northern tribes don't really get much of a mention in this. And again, the reason why, they didn't go into a captivity from which they returned. When God allowed the Assyrians to come and to take out the northern tribes, they never came back into the land. That's different from what happened in the south. And again, because of the promises, I believe, made to David and then through Solomon, even though his line failed, we studied that last week. Nonetheless, the promise of a Messiah coming through the line of David is key to everything. That doesn't bring the north into the discussion. It's only through Judah that this is an issue, because David was a son of the tribe of Judah. He was a descendant of Judah, one of the sons of Jacob. So if that's the case and a promise was made about a Messiah that would come through David's line, that must be preserved, because that's the history of mankind. That's the eternity of mankind is dependent upon that. And God made the promise. He's not going to break it. So, not because they were perfect, God still brings them back. That's what we're studying right here. So by the time that we get, like I say, to the 28th verse of the first chapter, now the focus is on the children of Israel, beginning with Abraham and then his sons. So into chapter 2, we see in verse 34 that Abraham begat Isaac, and the sons of Isaac were Esau and Israel. Israel is Jacob. So his name is changed, as you can study through the book of Genesis. But this gives us, if you will, kind of the chain of custody. So from Abraham to Isaac, and then Isaac to Jacob, now it's the sons of Jacob, and that brings us to where we are in the tribes that are here present and who comes back from that captivity. So remember, the northern tribes, though you would have people all throughout the south in Judah that may have belonged to all of the other tribes, we're talking about the tribes that actually settled in those particular areas. And that is primarily Judah and mainly Benjamin. And then there were little bits and pieces that would come in, and we're going to see a few of them that were added in. Manasseh, part of Manasseh, and then Ephraim are mentioned as well, as we get into this a little bit further. So chapter 2, we get to this. Now, there were sons of Israel. These were the sons of Israel: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Joseph. Joseph ends up becoming two nations through Ephraim and Manasseh, the two sons born to him in Egypt. Now, if you've been through the book of Genesis with us, you know how that all worked out. So, goes on and it says Benjamin, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And so when they started to populate the land, and when they came in through Joshua, and even during Moses' time, as they're going through the wilderness, you never hear Joseph mentioned. You just hear Ephraim and Manasseh. And so those two tribes were given to Joseph by portion. And so that takes Levi out of the land allotment, because now you've got 13 tribes, not 12. But Levi never had taken possession of territories like the rest. Theirs was the service to the Lord. So with all of that said, we get in verse 3, the sons of Judah. They were Onan, and Shelah. And these three were born to him of the daughter of Shua the Canaanitess. The firstborn of Judah, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. Now, we don't get a lot of detail on what that is, but it really does open up a little bit of a glimpse to this, because in the book of Chronicles, you're going to find that this is kind of a history of how God is working in his people. And it's written, some have pointed out that Kings was written kind of more from a man's perspective. I guess it's a loose way of looking at it. And Chronicles would be, if God's telling the story, his emphasis is on the punishment of wickedness when it's necessary, but rather that wickedness shouldn't have to result anyway. And if people walked honorably before God, there aren't these problems. And so those will be the things that you'll see a lot more emphasis of. In verse 10 of chapter 2, it says, Ram, now this is to the line of David. This brings us to David. Ram begot Amminadab, and Amminadab begot Nahashon, the leader of the children of Judah. Nahashon begat Salma, and Salma begat Boaz. Now, you hear the name Boaz. Which Boaz is that? It's that Boaz. It's Ruth and Boaz. That's that guy, right? So then it tells us that Boaz begot Obed, and Obed begot Jesse, David's father. Jesse begot Eliab, the firstborn, Abinadab the second, Shemaiah the third, Nathaniel the fourth, Radai the fifth, Ozem the sixth, and David the seventh. These are the other brothers that were kind of paraded before Samuel, if you remember when David was chosen. Now, their sisters, it tells us who they were, and then that kind of brings us the whole line of David. and why that's important. But think about it. Ruth and Boaz are in David's line. So kind of a cool thing that you see how that all works through there. This helps us in understanding why is the genealogy so important to the Jewish people. And it's so that they don't just say, well, we have the right to be here. No, we have the right to be here because here's our generations. Now, our world today is so concerned with trying to point out that Israel's the usurper and they've taken over the land since the middle of last century. And, with different parts of the world, there's the question whether the Jews ever existed there. And we've been all throughout that country, myself, and, taking tours there and everything. And there are ruins all throughout there, 3,000 and 4,000 years old, that are testimony to who they are. There are synagogues all throughout the area. Those were places where people would gather together and they would study and worship the God of Abraham. So the idea that they haven't been in the land is just absurd from archaeology, if nothing else. So anyway, when I hear those kind of people that they're protesting that the Israel or that the Jews don't have a right to be in the land is just absurd. It's been theirs for thousands of years, and the evidence is everywhere that you look. So, chapter 3. Chapter 3 begins this way. Now, in verse 3 it says, "Now these are the sons of David who were born to him in Hebron." So if you remember, when David became the king, he didn't instantly get to Jerusalem. There was a time that he was down in Hebron, and so it says the third of them, as you'll see, well, I'll just read the first verse. "These were the sons born to him in Hebron. The firstborn was Ammon by Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and the second was Daniel by Abigail the Carmelitess. The third was Absalom." So that Absalom, the one who tried to kill him. Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, the king of Jeshur. The fourth was Adonijah, and the son of Haggith. Now in verse 5 we get this. "And there was born to him in Jerusalem Shemaiah, Shobab, and Nathan, and then Solomon, the four by," that's actually another way of saying Bathsheba, the daughter of Ameliel. So it wasn't until David had made it to Jerusalem as king that the whole thing with Bathsheba, we all know the story with that. But the sons that were born to David through Bathsheba, one of them is Solomon. So again, that's going to really set in motion everything from chapter 10 going forward, because it really focuses very briefly on Saul, but it really focuses on David and then into Solomon. And then we'll start to work through the other kings as we get into 2 Chronicles. So you'll start to notice if you're reading through this and you're okay with just reading through all the names, you're going to find that it starts to chronicle the sons of Jacob, the different tribes. Now, there's this really interesting thing. We'll find out how old some of you are in the Lord. But the church through the ages, not through the ages, it just in my lifetime, it loves fads. I hate it, but it loves fads. So somebody writes a book, everybody jumps on board. They don't even care about the theology of it. It's just if it's cool and everybody's talking about it, everybody buys in. Whether it's the purpose-driven life and that whole nonsense that went on with that, or if it's the Jesus calling and all that occult nonsense that's still taking place to this day. But there was a thing not anywhere near as big, but it was a book called The Prayer of Jabez, really tiny little thing. And it was all the rage for a while. And it was very popular among those people, especially the ones who like to think that, well, we should have things. And so the Prayer of Jabez was that thing that everybody loved, and everybody's saying, God, expand my borders and bless me, right? So because they wanted stuff. It's just such a tired thing that we see in the church. But anyway, the Prayer of Jabez was a big thing. People were praying this prayer because they read this little passage here. What I always found interesting about it was that it was always about the material things. God, expand my borders and give me stuff, right? Look at what Jabez actually asks for. Jabez was more honorable than his brothers, and his mother called his name Jabez, saying, because I bore him in pain, meaning of his name. So Jabez called upon the God of Israel, saying, O Lord, that you should bless me indeed, and that you would enlarge my territory. Okay, that's what got all the attention in the Prayer of Jabez. So then everybody started doing it. God, let me have blessing. And of course, they would always try to hide it in saying, so that I can be used of you and blah, blah, blah. So that was the nonsense behind it. What you didn't find a lot spoken of was this, that your hand would be with me and that you should keep me from evil. Wouldn't that be the best thing if you could ever pray? God, would your hand be upon me and would you keep me from evil things? See, this kind of almost reminds me a little bit of Solomon. When God had asked him, what would you have me to give to you? And he says, I don't know how to lead them like my dad did. How do I take them out and how do I bring them back in? David, my father, was really good at that. He doesn't know what he's doing. And he acknowledges that. So he says, would you give me the understanding to do that task like my father? And God says to him, not only am I going to say yes to that, I'm going to make it where there's none like you ever before or after when it comes to knowledge and wisdom and all those things. And because you didn't ask for all the riches and all the stuff that normally people would ask for, I'm going to give you that too in ways it's never been seen before. So this whole Jabez thing, do I believe that if God was going to bless him and expand his territories and whatever all that means, would it be based upon rather that he said, keep me from evil and have your hand upon me? Because it says he's a righteous man. So the focus should never be on the material things. Yet the church, so much of the church is absolutely consumed with that, and it is disgusting. But here's where if you ever wonder where the prayer of Jabez come from, if you even know what I'm talking about, if not, I'm sure they got a Wikipedia on it or something. But here's where that comes from. But look at what he says, that your hand would be on me, and that you would keep me from evil, and that I may not cause pain. So God granted him what he requested. What an amazing thing. It's the second part of what he asks that is so incredibly impressive. And I wish that it was something that the church genuinely understood, that we would be more concerned with those things rather than what this world might give to us. It's amazing. I mean, here we are, the beginning of November of 2021, and the world is melting down like I've never seen it in all my years as a believer. And yet so much of the church is just going on like nothing's happening. They're completely unaware that God is doing things in the world, and I believe really making it ripe for judgment. I believe the Lord's going to return soon. When he does, I don't know. But the stuff that the world seems to be focused in on is just embarrassing. So anyhow, from chapters 4 and into 5, we get the sons of Jacob and who their line was, from those first 12 sons of Jacob and then their descendants. What we get in verse 18 of chapter 5, it says, the sons of Reuben, the Gadites, and half of the tribe of Manasseh had 44,760 valiant men who were able to bear shield and sword, and who shot with the bow, skillful in war, and they went to war. And they made war with the Hagarites, Jether, Naphish, and Nodab. And so the reason these are brought up here, just as a reminder to us, the area where they settled, when you're looking at it on a map, if you remember, the land of Israel is kind of the border, if you will, was the River Jordan. So everything from there to the west was what we would consider Israel proper. But if you remember when they were settling the land, because they came up above the Dead Sea before you get to Galilee, and they came in this area, right? But if you remember, it was Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh's tribe that said, we want to stay on this side of the Jordan because they saw it as a very favorable area. Joshua was the one that said, you just want to get out of fighting. And they said, oh, no. We'll stay. We'll leave our families and everything else. We'll come and help subdue the land, but we'd like to come back here and stay here. So Gad and Reuben stayed east of the Jordan River, and Manasseh, half of that tribe, settled above them, north of them, more towards up in Syria, that part, towards Galilee. And then down over here was the other part of Manasseh, just above Ephraim, which was above Benjamin and Judah. So you can look it up on your map of the tribal allotments, but it's just pointed out here. So verse 23, it says, so the children of the half-tribe of Manasseh, they dwelt in the land. Their members increased from Bashan to Baal Hermon, that's up to the north, and that is to Senir in Mount Hermon. So chapter 6, we begin with Levi's sons, and it gives that genealogy. By chapter 6, verse 49, it says, now Aaron, now we've moved to the descendants of Aaron, Aaron and his sons, they offered sacrifices on the altar to burnt offerings and the altar of incense for the work of the most holy place, and to make atonement for Israel according to all that Moses, the servant of God, had commanded. And then it gives the names of those priests. So think about what's being done here. They're able to explain in this genealogy how they settled the land. Also by the tribes themselves. And now we're getting through the descendants that were to see through to the priesthood and to the proper worship as it should have been, showing that they've had a presence in the land since the days of Moses all the way up to their times. So again, if they just come back to the land at the end of that captivity and that's it, great, you're just occupying the land. But are you going to put things back the way that they are supposed to be, and a proper worship, a proper way of honoring God and honoring the law? And that's what was done through Nehemiah and into Ezra. And so they're looking back at the history of why are we here in the first place? Do we have the right to be here? Are we the descendants? That's what's being laid out here. So it's vitally important to them, and that's why this is so carefully structured, even to the point where let's deal now with the priests, starting with Aaron. Now, these, verse 54, now these are their dwelling places throughout their settlements in their territory, for they were given by lot to the sons of Aaron, the family of the Kohathites, a group of priests within the priesthood. They gave them Hebron, the land of Judah, its surrounding common lands, but the fields of the city and its villages they gave to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. Now that's the Caleb that spied out the land along with Joshua. So if you remember Joshua and Caleb, what it said of them during Exodus, what it said of those two was that there was a different spirit in them. Because as they spied out the land, unlike the other 10, they had said, yeah, there's all those things. There's all the reasons that were given as excuses not to go in. But God gave us the land. Let's go. So that was Joshua and Caleb, and God says of them, they had a different spirit in them. They weren't men filled with fear. They were men who were filled with faith. And so Caleb's given that area that he had asked for. And it says, now the sons of Aaron, they gave one of the cities of refuge. And those cities of refuge, if you remember, if a person kills someone else by accident, wasn't a deliberate thing, they could run to that city of refuge and they could be left alone until the death of the priest. So chapter 7, you get the sons of Issachar that are mentioned here, and then you start to get into the sons from Naphtali in verse 13 of chapter 7, Manasseh in verse 14. You just start to get through those. Now, in chapter 8, you get the sons of Benjamin, and these really are just kind of the names that are there. And so it's just to them, to the Jewish people, especially at the time, insanely important that they know we have the right to be here tribe by tribe and person by person. There's no sense in me trying to go through them because most of these people, other than they're mentioned here or maybe a mention in a few other places, depending on how prominent they are, we will be able to piece the names together, but we know nothing of their history. So just to read through them, it really doesn't tell us a whole lot. So it doesn't mean so much to people studying the Bible in the 21st century, other than in the big picture. Do they have the right to be there? Yes. Are they the descendants all the way back to Abraham? Absolutely. Are they the descendants that trace it all the way back to Adam? Yeah, it's here. It's done deliberately. It's done because it is their land. It's done because it was given to them by promise. So that brings us to chapter 9, which is kind of just the wrapping up of the first part of the book, and then we'll transition right into chapter 10. So verse 9 says this, so all Israel was recorded by genealogies, and indeed they were inscribed in the book of the kings of Israel, but Judah was carried away captive to Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. Now this is why it's so important. This lets us know this is clearly post-exile. And so it tells us that was taken away. This is written from the perspective after they have come back in. Verse 2 says, and the first inhabitants who dwelt in their possessions, in their cities, were Israelites, priests, Levites, and the Nethinim, which were servants in the temple. Now, in Jerusalem, the children of Judah dwelt, and some of the children of Benjamin, and some of the children of Ephraim and Manasseh. So again, written from the perspective, and there will be other places that we'll be able to point to as we go through this, but it's pretty clear that this is written historically after even the book of 2 Kings, which, because it shows that they went into captivity, it clearly had to be after the conquering of the Babylonians. This is after the conquering of the Babylonians by the Persians, and then ultimately being sent back all the way to the time of Ezra, and that covers over 100 years from their exile. So this is written after all of that's done, and it's going to look back on the history that brought them to where they are, and it's going to tell that history from a different perspective than we got in the Kings. So chapter 9 just kind of cleans up the rest of the people who came back. And if you want to look through them, you can see there's just little bits and pieces of when they came back. Chapter 10, this will just show you. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines, and they fell slain at Mount Gilboa. So that'll tell you where we're going to. Chapter 9 really is going to go backwards because it's going to deal with the kings in Judah. It's going to start with Saul, and then it's going to go to David. But like I said, Saul's mention is very, very brief, as we see here in verse 2. The Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. And then the battle was fierce against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was wounded, and this is where he was put to death. So notice how quick the transition goes from chapter 9 to chapter 10. That's what we're going to pick up next week. I know this is very much abbreviated, and I know that it covers 9 chapters, but if you go back and you desire to look at it, you'll see it really does. It tries to be very careful, though it's not exhaustive, to make sure that there's not a question of whose land it is. And as they come back into the land, do they have the right to be there? And if they have the right to be there, that also means that they have a history. What does that history require of them? The history requires of them that they recognize who's put them there in the first place, and that they are to honor him, and that God has given to them instruction of how they can do so rightly. And this is really the focus of Nehemiah, and especially of Ezra. And so as we study through those, when we get to those books eventually, you'll see that there is a real desire on behalf of the people to do rightly and honorably before God, initially anyway. And even at that, you're going to find that there are plenty of, when we get to those histories, there are people that rebelled against it even then, not even recognizing that God had miraculously brought them back into the land through no merit of their own, and yet they were going to rebel against him in short order. So pretty interesting to see. So I can feel my voice is starting to give out. I'm thankful it's worked this long. We'll pick up in chapter 10 next week, and we'll start to work our way through. It feels like we're already halfway through the book and we just started. But we'll see that there really is, if you're the type that's studied through the Kings and even through Samuel's, you're going to see the perspective and how this is written just has a little bit of a different flavor to it. So it'll be fun to go through it. I very much enjoy doing these, and I hope that they're helpful to you and that they're instructive as you study through God's Word. And I pray that they really do bless you and that you grow in your knowledge of Him. So we'll get together next week and we'll study through this. Join us on Thursdays. We're going through, currently, we are in the book of Ephesians, and we're getting close to being done with that. And would really love to have you along with us. And just pray that these really bless you and help you in your knowledge and your walk with God, and that He instructs you through His Word. So until Thursday, or if I see you next Sunday or next Monday for our study through Chronicles, may God bless you.